In the beginning, there was the girl group, and they sounded something like this. Or this.
Is there a letter for me?
Or this. And if that's too old for you, maybe you remember this.
If you want to be my lover, you gotta get with my friend.
All right, this is all fine, but the whole concept of the girl group really bugs some people, including a lot of women. Oh, sure, anyone can dress up a couple of hot chicks, put them out front and let them sing. But what about a real girl band? You know, where everyone from the singer to the drummer has Y chromosomes. Well, I don't know, why not? Seems fairly simple now, right? But back in the day, it wasn't so simple. Here, let me show you what I mean.
Now, the ongoing history of new music.
One of several all-female groups to come out of the whole grunge thing in the early 1990s. That's L7 with Pretend We're Dead, from a pretty decent 1993 album entitled Bricks Are Heavy. We'll get back to them and that whole scene a little bit later on. Hello again, I'm Alan Cross, and this is a show about rock goddesses, specifically the greatest and sometimes very influential all-chick bands in the history of new rock. Oh, I'm sorry, I meant all-female. And I do mean all-female. No female solo artists, no female-fronted bands. I'm talking about 100% women, from the singer and the guitar player to the bass player and the drummer. So, sorry Courtney, sorry Shirley, sorry Chrissy, but for this program, no boys allowed at all. You'll have heard of some of these performers. Others, well, you know what, maybe not. But that doesn't mean they don't deserve respect and credit for knocking down some pretty major gender barriers, destroying some pretty strong stereotypes, and breaking through some very nasty prejudices. First of all, some history and context. The traditional girl group concept is as old as rock and roll itself. Back in the day, you got a bunch of cuties, you made them look real pretty, and you let them sing. And, don't worry about writing the songs, girls. In the majority of the cases, men would take care of that. And don't worry yourself about having to play an instrument. We'll get the men to do that. You just, look and sound nice. The result was an entire branch of rock history in the 60s that featured this kind of music. We had the Shangri-Las and the Ronettes and the Chiffons and the Supremes. There were the Shirelles, Martha and the Vandellas. You get the idea. It wasn't until the very late 1960s that anyone really began to consider that you could have a rock or pop group that was completely made up of just women. And surprisingly, it was a cartoon that got things rolling. Josie and the Pussycats. They were not only a manufactured band, they weren't even, real. They were a Saturday morning cartoon creation by William Hanna and Joseph Barbera, the kings of cartoons in the 60s and 70s. They were the creators of such shows as The Flintstones and The Jetsons and Yogi Bear. They were encouraged to go deeper into music by the success that they had seen with their first animated musical creation, The Archies. Josie and the Pussycats were a spin-off from the Archies, kind of like we have Joey as a spin-off from Friends. Not only were they one of the first all-female rock-pop bands we ever saw, complete with a female drummer and a female bass player, they also broke down a racial barrier by having an African-American bass player. This was very progressive stuff in the late 1960s. And you know what? They did all right with their bubblegum thing. They even released an album in 1970 that became somewhat mythical. And you may have heard of their real-life singer. Her name was Cheryl Ladd. Yeah, that's right. The woman who would later replace Farrah Fawcett on the original Charlie's Angels TV show was the singer in Josie and the Pussycats. All right, so much for them. Let's talk about another groundbreaking all-female trio that weren't quite as successful or talented. They were called the Shaggs. The Wiggins sisters, Dot, Helen, and Betty, were from Fremont, New Hampshire, and they were shepherded into the world of rock by their father, Austin Wiggins. Now, for some reason, he thought his daughters had the kind of talent that would make them rock and roll superstars. Unfortunately, the girls had absolutely zero talent and zero ability. But what they did have was a lot of passion for what they did, as misguided as that was. Austin not only managed to get the girls into a studio, he managed to convince someone to release an album. And even more freakishly, a lot of people ended up buying this record, including me, honestly. By the 1980s, the Shaggs had become legendary for their sheer awfulness. And today, they're considered to be one of the most important bands in the history of what's become known as outsider music. Music enthusiastically made by people with absolutely no self-awareness of their complete lack of talent and no clue. Just really no clue. But that's almost besides the point. What's important is that they wouldn't take no for an answer. An excellent lesson in perseverance for thousands of all-female bands that would follow. Let me play something, and I'm going to warn you right now. What you're about to hear is very, very difficult to stomach. But sometimes, the history of rock is made up of such things. So be brave, stick it out. From their 1969 debut record, Philosophy of the World, here are the Shaggs with the title track.
Oh, the rich people want what the poor people's got, and the poor people want what the rich people's got, and the skinny people want what the fat people's got, and the fat people want what the skinny people's got. You can never please anybody in this world. The short people want what the tall people's got, and the tall people want what the short people's got. The little kids want what the big kids got, and the big kids want what the little kids got. You can never please anybody in this world. Oh, the girls with short hair want long hair, and the girls with long hair want short hair. Oh, the boys with cars want motorcycles, and the boys with motorcycles want cars. You can never please anybody in this world. It doesn't matter what you do, it doesn't matter what you say. There will always be one who wants things the opposite way. It doesn't matter where you go, it doesn't matter who you see. There will always be someone who disagrees. We do our best, we try to please, but we're like the rest. We're never at ease. Oh, the rich people want what the poor people's got, and the poor people want what the rich people's got, and the skinny people want what the fat people's got, and the fat people want what the skinny people's got. You can never please anybody in this world.
Hello? Still there? Yeah, the Shaggs with Philosophy of the World from 1969. Yes, I know it was awful, but very important when you're considering the history of the all-female band in terms of new rock and alternative music. And again, my apologies, but, sometimes history ain't pretty. By the time things moved into the middle 1970s, some of those gender barriers started breaking down a little bit more, although it would take some time before the world started to really get used to this whole concept. We need to make a slight detour into the world of metal. In 1975, a rather eccentric Hollywood record producer named Kim Fowley met a woman named Carrie Chrome at a house party hosted by Alice Cooper. They decided at that party that they should form an all-female rock band using several of Carrie's teenage friends, including someone called Joan Larkin. By the beginning of 1976, they had a band. Joan Larkin was now called Joan Jett, and the band was called the Runaways. Now, the Runaways never got any respect. Kim Fowley was known as a guy who loved gimmicks, and the Runaways, some of whom wore lingerie on stage, was blasted as some kind of cheap exploitation of a group of teenage girls, and the teenage boys that would, maybe they were just too far ahead of their time. I mean, this is the 1970s after all, and maybe the world wasn't ready for a five-piece, all-female, hard rock group made up of teenage girls who sang about sex and drugs. Bottom line was that the Runaways were pretty much universally panned. But that doesn't mean they didn't have an impact. Joan Jett would later go solo and be hailed as one of the most important inspirations for the Riot Girl movement, which would follow a decade later. And if you talk to the people in the Sex Pistols, they will tell you that they were big fans of the Runaways. Here's a quick shot from them. This is their biggest hit, a song called Cherry Bomb.
Can't stay at home, can't stay in school. Old folks say you're pulling a fool. Stay on the street, I'm the girl next door. I'm the fox you've been waiting for. Hello, Daddy,
The Runaways. Not respected then, but considered pioneers for all-female bands now. Okay, we're now ready to get into the realm of punk rock, alternative music, and new rock. If we're going to be complete, we have to look at 4 sets of founding mothers. That's coming up next.
You're tuned to the ongoing history of new music. This is the ongoing history of new music.
Welcome back to this look to the most important and most influential all-female bands in the history of new rock. So here we are in about 1976, and that was the big year for punk rock. There were 2 fundamental things about punk. Number 1, enthusiasm was more important than ability. And number 2, anyone with the guts to say something should be able to get up on stage and say it. So in other words, the only rule was that there were no rules. And if you wanted to break down some stereotypes and gender barriers, well then, you know what? It was almost your duty to go ahead and do it. There were a couple of notable English all-female bands that came out of this whole stew, and the first one was called the Slits. They were formed in 1976 when a 14-year-old kid named Ari Up met with her friend Palmolive at a Patti Smith show in London. They were so inspired by what they saw that night that they decided to put together an all-female punk rock outfit. The fact that they didn't know how to sing or play was really besides the point. Their good fortune was to have some friends in some interesting places, most notably Mick Jones and Joe Strummer of this new band called The Clash. They actually helped them tune their guitars. The stuff they recorded, when they recorded, was crude and very primitive. But to some, it was also very primal, very powerful. And not only did the Slits sound have this take no prisoners, I don't give a crap about what you think attitude, the group's image was also very much in your face. Their 1979 debut album featured all 3 members on the front wearing nothing but loincloths and some mud. Let me play you some Slits. This is from that 1979 record. By this time, the group had discovered reggae and a few other ethnic sounds. They had also found a producer who could make them sound passable. See what you think of this. The Slits with I Heard It Through the Grapevine.
Two of a kind, you know I love you more. much longer will you be my baby? I heard it with the grapevine. How much longer will you be my baby? I heard it with the grapevine. How much longer will you be my baby? So wondering how I knew about your plans to make me blue. Is some other girl you knew before? We're two of a kind, you know I love you more. Do you plan to let me go for this other guy you knew before? I'm just about to lose my mind. And I'm just about to lose my mind. And I'm just about to lose my mind. And I'm just about to lose my mind.
The Slits, one of the most important all-female bands of the punk and post-punk era. They, however, were not the only ones. There were at least 3 other groups who showed other women how it could be done. Here's a trivia question. If the Slits seemed to be the first all-girl punk band in the UK, who was the first all-girl punk band in North America? The answer seems to be The Curse, a Toronto band formed in 1977 who were part of that same crew that gave Canada punk rock bands like the Vile Tones and Diodes and Teenage Head. Like the Slits, they didn't bother to learn how to play their instruments before they started writing songs and performing. It was all about the anger and the energy. The Curse's most famous moment came in April of 1978 when they released a song called Shoeshine Boy. It was based on the true story of the abduction and murder of a 12-year-old boy named Emmanuel, whose body was later found on the roof of a massage parlor on Yonge Street in Toronto. Since this was a very sensitive issue at the time, the controversy over the song was huge, especially after the band sent the killers copies of the single in their jail cells. So give this a listen. Canada's and North America's first all-female punk rock band. This is The Curse with Shoeshine Boy.
Hey, Ricardo with the big brown eyes, yes, you're the kind that money can buy. Bring your friends if they're young and sweet, if they've got acne, leave them on the street. Shoeshine boy, is that your pay? How'd you earn $100 today? Shoeshine boy, is that your pay? How'd you earn $100 today? Emmanuel with the curly hair, why don't you climb on up? He's upstairs. Treat you just like one of the boys. Have some fun with a rubber toy. Shoeshine boy, is that your pay? How'd you earn $100 a day? Shoeshine boy, is that your pay? How'd you earn $100 a day? They'll beat you, mistreat you. They'll find you wrapped in a plastic bag. Hey, Papa with the light brown skin, that's just home moving, that's no sin. I know your mama, she prays for you. It's good shit down now, what you do? Shoeshine boy, is that your pay? How'd you earn $100 a day? Shoeshine boy, is that your pay? How'd you earn $100 a day? Hey, Ricardo with the big brown eyes, you're the kind that money can buy. Bring your friends if they're young and sweet, they've got acne, leave them on the street. Shoeshine boy, is that your pay? How'd you earn $100 a day? Shoeshine boy, is that your pay? How'd you earn $100 a day? Count all your pennies, add them up right. You just might be a millionaire by the end of the night. A movie star by the end of the night. A front page scandal by the end of the night.
The Curse, with the once extremely controversial single Shoeshine Boy from April 1978. Okay, here's ultra-important all-female band number 3, the Raincoats. They were formed in London in 1978, a year after The Curse and 2 years after the Slits. And like the Slits and the Curse, they were part of this great punk rock experiment of what could be done with rock and roll. By the time the group broke up in 1983, they had really nothing but a small cult following. But they did leave behind 3 albums, all of which would have a massive effect on this kid from Aberdeen, Washington named Kurt Cobain a little later in the decade. While he was alive, Kurt would tell anyone who would listen that the Raincoats were one of the greatest bands ever. And it wasn't until people started digging a little deeper that they realized that they were an all-female creation, which, gotta admit, was pretty cool.
I know this little girl, oh no I'm not gonna be, 'cause I don't wanna be, I never shall be in your family tree. Even if you ask me to, I'm gonna turn you down, I won't miss you around. Nice little girl, oh no I'm not gonna be, 'cause I don't wanna be in your family tree. Even if you ask me to, I'm gonna turn you down, I won't mess you around. Oh no, I'm
There's one other all-female punk band that must get our props before we move on, and they came from, of all places, Switzerland. Along with the Slits and the Curse and the Raincoats, we got to acknowledge the contributions of a group called Lilliput. They were formed in Zurich in 1978. Lilliput was a four-piece band who thought they'd like to take punk in a slightly different direction. They released a couple of records on England's Rough Trade Records before breaking up in 1983. Like the Raincoats, their following was very small but very loyal, and those who heard what Lilliput had to offer were often very inspired. Let me play you something from 1982. This is Lilliput from their self-titled debut album. This is called In a Mess. From Switzerland, that's Lilliput with In a Mess. Okay, you may not have heard of them before, but Lilliput is one of the essential all-female bands of the post-punk era, and of the whole new rock era, for that matter. In a moment, we'll go a little deeper into the 1980s for a look at a few more all-female post-punk bands who took the concept of girl power and really ran with it. Don't go anywhere.
You're tuned to the ongoing history of new music. This is the ongoing history of new music.
This is part one of a show on the most important and most influential all-female bands in the history of new rock. And notice that I said all-female. In this study, female-fronted bands and female solo artists are not allowed. To be on this list, the group has to be 100% chick-based. There are a few more bands that deserve our attention on this show, two of whom are from Los Angeles and one from Toronto. People forget that before they became top 40 acts, both the Bangles and the Go-Go's were very punk rock and or alternative. The Bangles used to be known as a garage band outfit called the Bangs, who featured an ex-member of the aforementioned Runaways. They were, well, kind of scruffy at the start. They were also part of a jangly REM-like alternative scene known as the Paisley Underground. If you ran across the Bangles in 1984, they would have been part of that whole college rock thing. It wasn't until the following year that they were cleaned up, tarted up, and turned into top 40 superstars. What, you don't believe me? All right, listen to this. This is before the whole walks like an Egyptian thing began. This is a 1984 single from the Bangles called Hero Takes a Fall.
Emotion is a virtue. For you it is the one fatal flaw. Sitting on your throne and drinking, thinking to return your call. And the story's got an ending. Look out, here it comes, and I won't feel bad at all. When the hero takes a fall. When the hero takes a fall.
The Bangles. Yes, those Bangles. In the days before they went all top 40 on everyone. That's a 1984 single called Hero Takes a Fall. And then there are the Go-Go's. Like the Bangles, they turned into this top 40 hit machine in the 80s. But back in the day, they had a very punk rock attitude. In fact, it was as strong as any attitude found in any guy. In fact, when the band was in their top 40 phase, the Go-Go's were harder partying than almost any all-male group you want to mention. There was booze, there was cocaine, there was lots of sex. It was really tough to keep up with any of the women in the Go-Go's. When they were formed in 1978, the Go-Go's were known as the Misfits. No, not those Misfits. Another one. They played all the punk clubs, and they even went on tour across the UK with Madness. Their big hit song, We Got the Beat, was originally an underground new wave hit. It wasn't until the women were signed that it was remixed for mainstream consumption. Now, you want to see what I mean about the Go-Go's being decent punk rockers? This is from the time when the group was playing the punk clubs in Hollywood. These are the same goody-goody Go-Go's of the 80s playing something in the 70s called Johnny, Are You Queer? The Go-Go's from the days before they were discovered by the mainstream. Very punk rock, very inspirational for a generation of female musicians. Let me play you something from Toronto's Fifth Column. They were formed in about 1980 under the name Second Unit, and they did their thing along the Queen Street Strip. Their thing was ultra-feminism. Each band member went by just their first name and last initial as a protest against being handed down a name by a man. In other words, their fathers. Fifth Column was very in-your-face about everything, including their album titles. They released records with titles like All Women Are Bitches and To Sir with Hate. Not exactly subtle, but you get the point. The group published a feminist magazine called Hyde, and when they played live, they often performed with go-go dancers. Male go-go dancers. This is the kind of feminist punk rock that helped lay the foundations for the Riot Girl movement later in the decade. This is what Fifth Column sounded like. Okay, you ready for this? This is All Women Are Bitches, Repeat.
Which are more dangerous, men or guns?
Both are dangerous, but only a man can kill you.
Or at least try.
be so sad. Don't be so angry, honey, things can't be all that bad. Wanna make a bet? Oh yeah. I don't like the way your boyfriend looks to me, oh yeah. I don't like the smell of his aftershave, and he reeks of suspicion as well. Oh yeah. And can you blame him? I know what he's thinking. Oh, women are. Don't be so angry, honey. Don't you be so sad. Don't be so angry, honey. Things can't be all that bad. Ha!
to, just because Mommy's a little angry sometimes. Yes, Dad? Don't take it personally, son, because why, Dad? Because all women are bitches, son. You see, really, Dad? All women are!
Don't be so angry, honey. Don't you be so sad. Don't be so angry, honey. Things can't be all that bad. All women are bitches.
Toronto's ultra-feminist fifth column. Back with a look ahead to part 2, right after this.
You're tuned to the ongoing history of new music. This is the ongoing history of new music.
This past hour was designed to give respect to the all-female bands who made it possible for this sort of thing to be commonplace these days, the founding mothers, so to speak. But believe it or not, we have not covered them all. There are more grunge groups that deserve some props. We've only touched on the whole Riot Girl thing, and there's a whole chapter that we have to do on Japan. Yeah, Japan. If we want to do it right, we got to go there. Plus, we should really look at some of the more important all-female bands of today, don't you think? Well, we will. Part 2 of alt-rock's greatest all-female bands. Next time with the ongoing history of new music. Technical productions by Rob Johnston. I'm Alan Cross.
You've been listening to The Ongoing History of New Music, a Deep Sky production.